Needless to say, Parmenides was not a popular guy. In fact, most people thought he was batshit insane, and I'm not sure I disagree. He had a lot of critics, but he also had an apprentice named Zeno, who rigorously came into his defense. He did this primarily through presenting paradoxes. He used a form of argument that we would later come to call reductio ad absurdum, which is the strategy in which you adopt the position of the opposition and you try to steer their logic down a road of absurdity. And he does this through a lot of paradoxes. In fact, the next question deals with this. It asks, what are some examples of Zeno's paradoxes? How does he use them to defend Parmenides' philosophy? Well, the book gives us several examples, so let's just jump right in. The first is an argument against the senses, and I quote from the book on this. If we drop a small millet seed on the ground, it will make no noise. However, if we drop a bushel of millet seeds, they will make a thud. Either 1. Millet seeds do not make a sound when they are dropped, or 2. Millet seeds do make a sound when they are dropped. Which of the two experiences are we to believe? If 1 is true, then our senses deceived us when we heard a sound. And if 2 is true, then our senses deceived us when we did not hear a sound. Either way, the senses are unreliable, and it makes perfect sense because, later philosophers would definitely pick up on, calling the senses into question, so Zeno had something going there. The second argument is one against plurality. Let me use an example. Let's suppose just for a second that, indeed, CD and eraser are two different objects, and that they are not one and the same. Well, they must be made up of even yet further things that separate them. That's what Zeno thought, anyway. Let me explain further with this piece of paper. Zeno would argue that, okay, if this piece of paper is separate from other things in the world, then surely it itself is plural. Zeno is an extremist in this sense. He says that, okay, if you believe pluralism, then go all the way with it, and assume that because everything is separate, well, surely every single object is separate too, in and of itself. So he would say, okay, cut this piece of paper in half. All right, now let's cut the halves of those pieces of paper in half, and cut those in half, and cut those in half, and keep going indefinitely until we have finally cut it down as much as we possibly can. But because Zeno is a rationalist, he says that, well, we're going off of the logic that says that we're cutting it in half, which ultimately means that you're not ever going to finish it because you're only cutting it in half. Does that make sense? In that way, he said that pluralism is an absurdity because nothing can ultimately be plural without being completely infinite. He uses the same kind of logic in the next paradox, which is one of motion. He uses the example of a racer running a race. If the racer runs half the length to get to the finish line, okay, that's fine. Then he runs half of the second half of the race, and half of that, and half of that, and half of that, until eventually, well, he's not ever going to reach the finish line because he's only running half of the distance that is left to him. And this doesn't really make sense because if we think about the concept of a race, well, a race is there to be run and to be won. He's going to cross the finish line. It's just the way that a race works. But because Zeno is a rationalist, an extreme rationalist at that, he does not think about these things as if he lived in the real world. He looks at it all through a pure and harsh lens of logic. And he says that, well, he can't ever finish that race if he's just going through a distance of halves. Of course, no one ever said that, the racer had to be going, through halves and not just, try to finish the entire race, but this was the position that Zeno adopted when he was dealing with Parmenides' critics. And admittedly, these are pretty clever paradoxes. I mean, I get it. When I look at it logically, it makes perfect sense. And a lot of people throughout history have spent a great deal of time, money, and ink to try and understand these paradoxes. But ultimately, it's very silly. And I quote the book on this. Before we dismiss Zeno with a disgusted wave of the hand, it is worth pointing out that all great advances in human thought have gone against entrenched common sense. Yeah, not everything that Zeno points out makes perfect sense in the beginning, but then again, he's following logic, he's following rationalism, not empiricism. And the natural human tendency is to follow empiricism more than rationalism. It's just what makes sense to us because we trust our perceptions. Zeno and Parmenides did not trust our perception. They did not trust perception at all. No, they liked to work things out purely through logic. But see, I can point out a flaw in that. Okay, so they don't trust the perception to judge the world accurately around them. That's fine. But reason is in and of itself a perception. Let's say there's a philosopher who is completely blind, deaf, and mute. Well, this person still has one sense left to them, one perception left to them, their reason. Parmenides and Zeno are they're using a perception that they condemn. They condemn perception, but they are using the perception of reason to build all these arguments. It's circular. That doesn't make very much sense. Much like David Hume, but we'll get to that. Anyway. Yeah, that's the Eleatics. These guys confused they went directly from reason and logic to language, and it didn't translate very well. They didn't consider syntax very much. They're an example of a fertile error. They were raising legitimate questions that would later be addressed by really prominent philosophers like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. It's really important that these questions be asked, and of course, this is pre-Socratic philosophy. It's not the answer that is as important as the question, and Parmenides and Zeno did indeed ask a lot of questions. Silly questions. Anyway, that's all for today. See you next time. Bye-bye.
I'm driving only 3 wheels these days, but my dear, how about you? I'm going slightly mad.